So welcome back everyone to the Let's Talk Europe episode, and today we have a special guest, a guest that we already had once on our show, who is a professor and an expert on political and historical matters, of course, Ukraine. And since we usually talk about this part of the world these days, today is going to be no exception, and we're going to talk about quite a different perspective that than we talked last time, because last time we talked about the basic question: is there a split between the East Ukraine and West Ukraine? So if somebody hasn't listened to the episode, please check the episode, which is about 2 months old. And today we're gonna basically focus on the struggle and the fight for the independence, and what are the differences between the Eastern European Slavic nations. I would like to focus probably on two, mainly Ukraine and Belarus, but maybe Taras will have some other examples. So hello, Taras.
Good morning or good afternoon.
Well, yeah, it depends, these days it can be morning or evening. So many people actually consider an example, like the Belarusian state of civic society and the Ukrainian at the present moment as quite opposite. Do you think actually there are differences in the region between the maturity of the civic society of the nations which formed after the collapse of Soviet Union? Maybe there are some factors that you would like to, I don't know, explain to us and to our listeners. What is your take on the differences between the Ukraine and Belarus?
Well, there was always already a strong difference even in the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, Ukraine had the highest proportionate number of political prisoners of any republic, and when Ukrainian dissidents talked about the memoirs about life in the Gulag, the main people who they were sitting with were from the three Baltic states. So they were like the largest group. Then you had Georgians, Armenians, not many, very few Russians, and even fewer Belarusians. So I think in terms of famous Belarusian dissidents in the Soviet Union, there was less than 5. It was a very small opposition movement, and that I think was a reflection of how Belarus had been very Sovietized and very Russified by the Soviet regime, and hence Lukashenko was popular for many years, and he was elected for once at least. He was elected democratically in 1994. And so I don't want to insult Belarusians, but it always, to me, Belarus looked like a Bolshoi Donbass, like a big Donbass, very Soviet in identity, and very Russian speaking. And of course, this was to do with history. Belarusian language and culture had been destroyed. They had not been allowed to grow, whereas Ukrainian had been allowed to grow in the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
But Taras, many people think that basically in the time of the revolutions, I'm talking about the spring of the nations era, revolution. I mean, Belarus did not have enough time to basically form. That's one of the opinions why it's lacking behind the rest. Do you think it's a factor, or
you mean late 1980s?
Well, probably in this region it was early 20th century, but yeah.
Well, I mean, early 20th century, sure, but I think the problem was that all of Belarus was occupied by Tsarist regime, by the Tsarist Empire, whereas only part of Ukraine was occupied by the Tsarist Empire. And the Tsarist Empire was brutal in its Russification. It banned the Ukrainian language, banned Belarusian language and culture, and tried to impose its so-called nationality policy, which was to talk about a pan-Russian nation, Общерусский народ, which is what is popular now in Russia. So Great Russians, Little Russians, White Russians. There was in Tsarist ideology, as in white Russian emigres, there was no Belarusian nation and no Ukrainian nation. Ukraine was able to succeed in some ways better because it had, I think, a bigger history, like with Ukrainian Cossacks, 19th century national movement in Kiev, but also because a large proportion of Ukraine was not occupied by Russia. In Romania and in especially the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. And the Austrian-Hungarian Empire promoted Ukrainian national identity. So it was doing the opposite of the Tsarist Empire. In the Tsarist Empire, Ukrainian identity and Belarusian identity was crushed, was repressed, was suppressed. In the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, Ukrainian identity was promoted as a counterweight to the Polish identity. Belarus, unfortunately, was all part of the Russian Empire. So it had a very weak national movement in 1917 and 1918. And that also meant that one of the big differences between Belarus and Ukraine was that Ukraine always had a very strong national communist movement. You had this in Lithuania as well. I mean, with your first kind of national leader back in the late 1980s, who was the leader of the Lithuanian Communist Party. You had also national communists, quite a strong national communist movement in Ukraine, especially in 1920s, 1960s, and in the Gorbachev period. In Belarus, the national communist movement was very weak compared to Ukraine. So that's another factor. And in the late 1980s, if you look at Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, only really Ukraine had a mass popular movement, popular fronts, like in the Baltic states. In Russia, it was also weak, primarily just Moscow, St. Petersburg, but not throughout Russia. Belarus had some strong elements, particularly on questions of Stalinist crimes, but it wasn't a mass movement. Again, Ukraine had the benefit of Kiev being a very, very nationally conscious city, and also Western Ukraine. So it's a huge number of people. And what you've seen in Ukraine in the last 30 years, since 1991, is the spread of Ukrainian identity from the West to the East. You saw this with the Orange Revolution, when Yushchenko was elected to power, and then you saw it with the Euromaidan Revolution. Belarus didn't go through those events. And I joke, compared to Russia, Russia's last revolution was in 1917. Ukraine has had 3 revolutions since 1990. And why are they important? Because these revolutions in Ukraine weren't just anti-communist. They were demands for Europeanization, demands that ruling elites treat the population as citizens. This is very, very important to understand. You didn't have that kind of momentum in Belarus or in Russia. And in both countries under Lukashenko and Putin, you've gone backwards, not forwards. So in this war with Russia, Ukraine-Russian war, the difference between the two countries is very visible. In Russia, you have subjects, you have slaves still. In Ukraine, you have citizens. So you have a horizontally organized Ukrainian society fighting a vertically organized Russian society. And Russian society is still hierarchical, vertical. You need the Tsar, you need the boss. Without the boss upstairs, you don't know what to do. You have no initiative. You see this in the Russian army. Russian officers, if they run away, the soldiers are useless. And this is not true in the NATO army and in the Ukrainian army. Ukrainian army does not function as a hierarchical, force. Ukrainian soldiers, when they're fighting and looking for targets, they're not always telephoning back to Kiev. What should we do? What do we do? They operate independently. So this is a product of 30 years of different development, with a prehistory prior to this, in the Soviet Union also was different. Ukraine's 3 revolutions have been crucial in its Europeanization. Ukraine has had decommunization since the Gorbachev period, late 1980s. Then you had also the promotion of and investigation of Stalinist crimes, and kind of the negativity around Joseph Stalin as a criminal. And then in 2015, after the Euromaidan revolution, you had the passage of decommunization laws and the removal of 6,000 monuments of Lenin, and renaming of streets, opening up of archives, changing celebration of Great Patriotic War to commemoration of World War II. All of these changes happened. In Belarus and Russia, you've had the exact opposite. Cult of Great Patriotic War, which means also cult of Stalin, which means you downplay or you ignore Stalinist crimes. You, of course, ignore the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, because the Great Patriotic War begins in 1941. And you also have re-Sovietization in both Belarus and in Russia. To me, what's fascinating is that when these 700,000 Russians who have left Russia, even when they go to democratic countries like Georgia and Armenia, they still are slaves. They are still subjects. They tell us that, oh, in Russia, we can't protest against the war because it's a repressive regime, etc. I think this is all bullshit, because in Iran, it's also a dictatorship and they are protesting. And so, it's just a question of courage and bravery. In the Euromaidan revolution, 100 Ukrainians were killed by the regime. But okay, but then you are now in Georgia and Armenia. Why are you still silent? Why are you not protesting? Why are you not organizing groups and civil society? Why are you not writing articles, creating new media? Why are you not doing podcasts, blogs, etc.? Zero. So this has nothing to do with the repressive regime in Russia. It's to do with the mentality.
Well, there is probably a very, very small minority that does such things. We have some Russians in Lithuania who have left Russia and are kind of spreading the word of what's happening there. But it's such a small amount that it's actually hardly seen from the side. And you said
of course, you have these independent media projects like Medusa from Latvia, Doj, the TV station. But it's, as you say, 700,000 Russians have fled. That's a huge number of people, and double the number who were mobilized for the war. And those 700,000 could do a lot. Why don't they join the Russian Legion fighting against Putin in Ukraine? There are two volunteer battalions, one Belarusian, one Russian, besides the Georgian, of course. Why don't they're not doing anything? So I think the numbers of Russians who are doing some things are maybe 5% of the total number. And yes, they are active in Latvia, Lithuania, but I have not seen any anti-Putin activity in Georgia and Armenia since they arrived. It's like, I even saw one stupid video in Armenia where this guy from Russia was complaining, oh, he was now happy because in Armenia, these Western shops are open, which they were closed in Russia. That was the most important thing for him. So you're saying that the civic society, the absence of civic society and the absence of freedom perspective is in the blood of Belarusians and Russians. Well, we have to be careful. I think it's more than just a question of civil society. It's a question of mentality. Do you feel empowered as a citizen? Or do you not feel empowered and you feel still like you are a subject, like a serf in the Tsarist regime or in the Soviet regime? And I think for Russians, they are still subjects, they are not citizens, and they are slaves. They have that zombified slave mentality. Belarusians, we were all surprised in 2020 when you had the mass protests.
Well, to be honest, we were surprised, double surprised, because the protest itself was a surprise, but the absence of any geopolitical demands, the attitude towards Putin was also very surprising.
It was. There were a number of surprises. Firstly, practically everybody spoke Russian amongst those Belarusian protesters. There were no Belarusian speakers. So presumably this was all because they were all from towns and cities, not from smaller towns or villages. So the national identity factor wasn't as strong there as it was in revolutions in the Baltic states, or especially Ukraine. In Ukraine, civil society and national identity have always been closely tied together. So that was one factor. And you're right, the second factor was a kind of a geopolitical naivety. And because Ukraine was never a member of any of Putin's Eurasian organizations. Belarus is a member of both the Collective Security Organization, the so-called Putin's Warsaw Pact, and also the Eurasian Economic Union. So any democratic regime coming to power in either Russia or Belarus has to do a Brexit.
Yeah, that's a very good term.
Because Ukraine didn't have to do a Brexit. In 2014, when Ukraine had a revolution, there was no need for Brexit because Ukraine wasn't a member. It's never been a member of this CSTO since which was formed in the early 90s, and is not a member of the CIS Customs Union, which is now Eurasian Economic Union. Belarus is. And you're right that these Belarusian democratic leaders didn't talk about this, didn't say, well, you know, when we come to power, we will, for example, they could have said, we will hold a referendum where Belarusians will have a chance to decide should they stay in the Eurasian Union or join the European Union's Eastern Partnership. They could have said this, and so said, look, this is up to the Belarusians. It's there. We'll have a referendum. They didn't say anything about this. So you're right. They came across as quite geopolitically naive, brave in many cases, and naive. Maybe their political repression has made them less naive now than they were before.
Here I want to ask some clarification question. We know that this so-called opposition in Belarus, which is well, not elected because the election was a fraud, and you know you don't have an election, so it's not actually elected, and they are trying to kind of approach Ukraine from Vilnius, from Warsaw, different groups, and they try to get some kind of relationship with the official, Kiev. And there is no success. So does that say something about the so-called opposition of Belarus that we have at the moment, or about their, I don't know, background, identity, goals, or there are some other reasons for that?
I think that the reality is that I think there's more chance of them coming to power than Democrats in Russia. I see no prospect of Democrats coming to power in Russia if Putin is removed from power. In Belarus, everything is dependent on the war in Ukraine. There are two leaders, Kadyrov, leader of Chechnya, and Lukashenko. If Putin is kicked out for whatever reason, if he gets defeated, then Lukashenko and Kadyrov also leave. Their fates are tied to Putin. So if Putin goes, Lukashenko and Kadyrov goes in Chechnya.
So now, you think that the apparatus that for example, Lukashenko has in place, it wouldn't let him keep power if Putin is not like helping from the side?
Well, the only way he could stay in power after the 2020 elections was by asking for Russian support. So he's become a Putin puppet, totally, and he's given up his country's independence and sovereignty to become a Russian colony. So I just don't see how, without Putin's support, Lukashenko could survive, because his regime is kept in power by by the KGB and the Oman riot police. Those are the two structures. This is why I don't believe that Belarus would ever join the invasion of Ukraine, because the Belarusian army is not hostile to Ukrainians. And so I'm sure they would either join the Belarusian opposition or simply just surrender. And this would be very dangerous for Lukashenko. And that's why I think Lukashenko's not being willing to send the Belarusian army, because he's afraid that what would be the, could this lead to a kind of a coup against him? So he's kept in power by a very small number of people. I mean, the KGB and the Oman riot police, you're talking, I don't think more than 5,000-10,000 people. It's not a huge number of people. So I don't see him staying in power. No, and that would be the opportunity for some kind of, maybe like in Poland in 1989, some kind of transition round discussion, negotiations with the opposition, and with some people in the Lukashenko regime saying, well, actually, he did lose the elections, and we have a real person who was elected, and she should come back and be the Belarusian president.
But we cannot really say that that person was elected, because we don't know, and nobody knows. And probably, if that was true, all the evidence that she was elected is already gone, long gone, and straight after.
Sure. But I mean, in a kind of a revolutionary situation with Lukashenko leaving power, then, and if elections were held, then she would probably win the landslide. Then, because people, it's the reason why there was such massive protests in 2020 in Belarus was also people got fed up of Lukashenko. I mean, he's been in power
too long.
I mean,
just plainly too long.
And most people think of, I think there's been a kind of a growing maturity of Belarusian society, especially younger people, middle class people. And they just look at Lukashenko as, Halovat kolhospu. I mean, he's just the head of a collective file. He's dumb. And he's an embarrassment. Like when he said the way to combat coronavirus is to drink vodka and sit in a sauna. I mean,
and to drive tractor as well.
Yes, I mean, he's just he's a kolhosnik. I mean, it's if you're Belarusian, you have to be embarrassed by Lukashenko.
But we have to give him some credit, because he's a clever bastard. For so long he was able to balance, and he was sometimes, when the wind was flowing from a different direction, he was flirting with the West, flirting with the United States. Then if it's not good, he turns back to Kremlin. So there are some skills there.
Well, this is a kind of we would call it a hitri, a sly, cunning peasant. But his time has come, and I think the Belarusian opposition showed that it had a mass movement. I think the danger sign for Lukashenko in 2020 was when workers in factories began supporting the opposition. That's already, then you have a situation similar to Solidarity in Poland. So I think in many ways I am more optimistic about Belarus than Russia. Russia, I simply don't see how I don't see how the Democrats could ever come to power there.
Well, probably most of the foreign listeners don't even know that Russia never had a nation state. They never had a democracy, or maybe this brief period of Yeltsin in the early 90s, but that's it. They have no background of any other form of self-governance.
You're right. I think the problem, and it sounds very amusing, but Russians still don't know where Russia is. I mean, where is Russia? Because in the Soviet Union, most Russians saw the USSR as Russia. They did not see the Russian Soviet Republic as Russia. And the Soviet Russian Republic did not have any institutions. So, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, Ukraine, and other non-Russian republics had the Komsomol, Communist Youth Organization, Communist Party, Academy of Sciences, etc., etc. The Russian Soviet Republic did not, because the institutions in Moscow were Soviet. So Soviet and Russian identity were the same. Today, if you're Russian, you don't associate your identity with the Russian Federation. You associate it with Eurasia, USSR, Russian world, Eurasian Union, these kind of things. And until Russians begin to identify themselves and their identity with their republic and not with a kind of a big empire or sphere of influence, then they're going to have always this imperial mentality. I think we're in the process of changing that now, because Russia has already in effect lost its sphere of influence in Eurasia, and so I think we are experiencing a second 1991 now. In Eurasia, in the former USSR, the only two countries which remain Russian puppet states are Belarus and Armenia. That's it. Georgia is with Ukraine and Moldova. Azerbaijan is close to Turkey. Central Asia is under Chinese influence. If you just watch the last few months of how Kazakhs, Tajiks, and others, and Kyrgyz relate to Russia, they see a wounded bear now. They see a declining Russia. Russia doesn't have the manpower. Russia is so weak that it has to bring back thousands of soldiers from all these different places in Eurasia to fight in Ukraine. So the war in Ukraine has showed that Russia is a Potemkin great power and a Potemkin second big army, and that has had an impact on how other countries look at it. And of course, it's given the advantage to China. China is now the rising power. Russia is now the younger brother of China, and I think Russia knows that. I don't. The difference between Russia and China is that Russia has no economic power. It thought it had military power, and it doesn't even have military power. China has both military power and economic power. I don't know what Russia will be exporting after this war, because Europe is by next year will no longer be importing Russian gas, and nobody will buy Russian arms because they are useless. They're not very good. So I think we're in a period of very radical change, and it resembles 1991. It's the second disintegration of the Russian Empire.
But Taras, many politicians and and journalists and analysts in the West, they are kind of scared of this disintegration of Russia, because they say that look at these nuclear weapons, look at that, and all this is going to be a mess. What do you think? Like how this issue can be solved? Because nobody is really loudly speaking, or at least not enough, speaking of what could be the scenarios of transitions, or what can be offered to the opposition in Russia if there is such, and well, there is a bit, of course. And the most, of course, important question is there enough, capability, civic capability in Russia to actually form something, or it has to disintegrate, split into many different states, nation states, or some kind of territorial units that can be governed by others, or some other form?
Well, this is nothing new. In 1991 there was also a very big fear in the West of what they called a nuclear Yugoslavia, that it would be also, a lot of bloodshed, fighting between the republics at a time when many of those republics had nuclear weapons. I mean, only 4 republics had strategic nuclear weapons, these long-firing nuclear weapons: Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan. But most of the other republics had tactical nuclear weapons. So today, the only country today which has nuclear weapons is Russia, of course. It's a fear, but I just don't imagine that the nuclear, I think the bigger fear in 1991 was greater than now, because it's easier to steal a tactical nuclear weapon. Tactical nuclear weapon can be an artillery shell. Whereas you can't steal an ICBM. It's just too big, right? So I'm not as concerned and worried about this, especially because Russia's Putin's successor is likely to be similar to him, a Silovik, from the security forces, some kind of nationalist general. It's not going to be a Democrat in Russia, and one of the reasons is, as you were saying, is that it's to do with Russian identity. In the Soviet Union, the dissident movements in like the Baltic states, Georgia, Ukraine, Armenia, they were what were described as national democratic movements. What did that mean? It meant that they demanded both national rights and democratic rights at the same time. So they were against, the forcing of Russians to go live in places like Latvia, Ukraine, against Russification, against destruction of their culture and language, as well as for human rights as well. In Russia, there never was, and still there is no national democratic movement. Russian language was never repressed. Russian culture was never repressed. And Russians never demanded independence or sovereignty for their republic. No Russian dissidents or Russian nationalists said, we want to be independent of the Soviet Union. In 1991, Russia did not declare independence from the USSR. I mean, how could it? It would be too funny. So when Russia celebrates every year Russia Day, this is based on the July 1990 Declaration of Sovereignty. Not because there was no Declaration of Independence. Ukraine declared independence. Belarus declared independence a day after Ukraine. But Russia never declared independence. So there isn't that national democratic movement, and that has always been a weakness of Russia's democratic forces. In Belarus, then maybe there's slowly emerging, and if Lukashenko is removed in a post-Putin era, then that gives the Belarusian Democrats a chance, and also Belarusian geography is better because it has borders with 3 EU NATO members. So that also helps. The geography helps in the Belarusian case, and it could theoretically leave Eurasia and join the Eastern Partnership together with Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova.
But you see, it's a bit probably different situation at the moment because during this mobilization, we see that some parts of Russia are really not happy. I'm talking about Burats, and like Chechens, and so there might be some different outcomes compared to what was. And you were saying that you see like a replacement of Putin with another Putin. So we are not talking about disintegration. We are talking about some new phase of Russia. Or I understood you incorrect.
Well, I mean, again, if there's some kind of transition after Putin goes, it will be bloody in Russia, because this is a country which is a mafia state. So there's no honor amongst thieves, as we say in English. And so there will inevitably be some bloodshed, just like there was in 1953, when the military executed Beria, who was the head of the NKVD, and who wanted to take over after Stalin. So I think there will be some kind of bloodshed, but it would be amongst the elites fighting amongst themselves who would to take power, because they're all corrupt. You're right about the national minorities. Putin has deliberately used a greater proportion of national minorities than ethnic Russians until this new mobilization. And so you've had protests in places like Dagestan, Buryatia, and other parts of Russia which are not Russian ethnically. But remember, the difference was in 1991, 50% of the USSR was not Slavic. So the 3 Eastern Slavs made up about 55% of the population in 1991. So that meant that a huge number of people in the USSR were not Eastern Slavic, and so when they rebelled, the USSR couldn't survive. And what was happening was the Muslim population was growing, and Slavic population was declining. In the Russian Federation, Russians make up about, I think it's 80 or 85% of the population, ethnic Russians. So although these national minority groups control large territory, like, you know, the Tatar Republic and elsewhere, they have large amounts of land, but they are small in number. They're only about 15% of the population. And none of them have borders with foreign countries as well, which is also important.
Some of them have Mongolia,
Well,
China.
Buryat would probably be the only place. Buryatia and I think there are some other ones, but
Chechnya, let's say, also has a border with a foreign country.
With Georgia now, yes. And again, you know, once Kadyrov goes, if Putin goes, Kadyrov goes, because Kadyrov is even hated by many in the Russian elite, not just by amongst Chechens. And what if he goes, then there would certainly be bloodshed in Chechnya as to who will take power there. So, I mean, I think a lot of this will take place by next year. I just don't see the war continuing longer than next year. So I think it's, and today, by the way, today Putin declared, you can see that he's worried, Putin. He declared martial law in the 4 occupied territories of Ukraine. So Kherson, Zaporizhia, and the 2 occupied areas of Donbass, Donetsk and Luhansk. So for Putin to declare martial law in those territories shows he's worried. He's concerned that he's maybe losing control, because the newly mobilized Russians going to those areas do not provide him with the possibility of winning the war. They don't have hardly any training. They don't have any weapons, logistics. They're simply cannon fodder.
Well, he's just buying time with them.
Yes, exactly. He's just trying to hold the line rather than do offensives. And it's not going to work. The big danger for Russia is going to be wintertime, because Ukrainian soldiers will be wearing winter uniforms and will have hot food and logistics. Russian soldiers won't have anything like that. They will be freezing and with very little food. So there's also, today we hear, concerned with this martial law, that Russia is beginning to evacuate from Kherson. Now, what this means is that Ukraine is being successful in surrounding the city of Kherson.
You probably heard this stupid idea that they are evacuating the right side of the river, right bank, because of the potential flood if the dam is going to be demolished by the Ukrainians. But they didn't bother to look at the map that the right side of the river is higher, so you basically have to evacuate to the right side, not from the right side. But yeah, that's Russian,
Yes, it sounds a bit like those people smoking too many cigarettes near the air bases that Ukraine
absolutely has. Smoking kills.
And smoking kills, and sitting near open windows can be also dangerous because you can fall out of them in Russia. But I mean, this is important, kind of not only strategically but psychologically, because Kherson is the only oblast capital that Russia occupied after the invasion of 24th of February, the only one. So if Russia is withdrawing from Kherson, that shows how badly they are situated, their troops, and I think it shows that the Russian military have persuaded Putin that it's better to withdraw and pretend we need to withdraw for strategic reasons, because the alternative could be a kind of a Russian Stalingrad.
But most of the Russian sphere analysts, independent, I mean, like Piankovsky, they say that if Kherson falls, the victory, is in Ukraine's hands, and that's it. For Putin, it's kind of the last drop of his.
I think you're right that maybe that is again the reason why he's organizing a so-called a tactical retreat, shall we say, rather than having a kind of a second Stalingrad, because that would be more dangerous for Putin. But you're right that Putin will look weak. If you're a macho dictator like Putin, you cannot show that you are weak. You have to show always you're a tough man. So I think that Putin is on the slippery slope to going out. How this will happen, we don't have any previous precedent how this will happen, because communist states and post-communist states don't have a tradition of military coups. Like in Latin America or Southern Europe, there is no tradition of this. In fact, it only happened once in 1981 in Poland, when the Polish military did martial law, because they were told to by Moscow. It was a choice: either you do it or we send, Warsaw Pact invades Poland. But that was the only occasion, so no tradition. So it's difficult for us to know how will Putin be removed. Will he also be sitting near an open window, or will somebody blow up his long table? I don't know. We just don't know.
Well, there is a good tradition of, like Stalin
poison.
went. Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe it will be like a Skripal then, yes, like in England 4 years ago. But these are all gangsters and crooks around Putin. So there's no honor amongst thieves there. If they see Putin as too weak, then they will remove him. I don't see how they can regain the initiative on the battlefield. I think that's now too difficult for them. Impossible.
Absolutely. So, but like, if we are coming back a bit to the civic society issue, and fighting for the independence and that stuff. So, just to conclude, how do you see these perspectives for Russia? Will they follow some kind of pattern that has been, already done by other countries in Eastern Central Europe, or it's going to be something unique? Do Russians in general want some kind of democratic governance? Maybe they are just pure imperialists, and they will, just want to substitute and regroup, rest, and then, get back to their Ruski Mir, narrative and expansion.
Well, they need somebody like Ataturk, who came to power in Turkey in the early 1920s, and who created a modern Turkey from the ruins of the Ottoman Empire. So he said, no more empire, no more Turkish empire. We are now creating a new nation state. And Turkey in the 20s and 30s was actually a very progressive country. I even once joked to French students in my class, do you realize Turkey gave the vote to women before France did? And so, until you have somebody like that who turns his back on empire, on Russian imperialism, then I think it'll be difficult for Russians to turn away and to build a democratic society. What Putin has done over 20 years, he has so taken Russia backwards. He's taken Russians back to the Brezhnev era and to the pre-Gorbachev era. There's been a complete re-Sovietization of Soviet society, of Russian society, re-Stalinization of Russian society. That will take at least 20 years. If a Democrat comes to power in Russia, it'll take them 20 years to change that. This will not be changed overnight. And so Russia will have a lot of catching up to do, and also dealing with its past. The difference between Western Europe and Russia is that Western Europeans have been debating for the last 30 years, 40 years, the evils of empire, the evil of colonialism, evils of slavery. Russia has never done this, never. Eurasianism as an ideology says, we did our empire great. We were successful. We were fantastic. We were so nice to our non-Russians. We were different to West Europeans. Of course, this is Russian inferiority complex. So they need to deal with the legacy of empire. Nobody who has suffered under the Russian Empire says, agrees with them that, yeah, it was great. It was a fantastic place. Nobody agrees with them. And secondly, they need to come to terms and accept their responsibility for the war in Ukraine. War is committing genocide, and yet they're still in a state of denial.
But Taras, there is even more interesting stuff in this subject because not like long ago, a few weeks, one of the member of Russian opposition group, let's say, or bloc, or whatever we want to call it, Katz is his surname. He said that we don't owe anything, the opposition, he meant, of Russia, to anyone, especially to the Ukrainians. So this kind of attitude from an opposition person in Russia says something about the mentality.
Yes, it does. It does. It's like an ostrich hiding its head in the sand. They don't understand that it doesn't work like this. The Germans had to deal with their responsibility and guilt over Nazism. Russians haven't done that over Stalinism and over the war in Ukraine. And you see this in the polls. Levada Center a few months ago asked Russians, do you feel responsible for the war in Ukraine? And 2/3 of them, 65%, said, no, we do not. If they continue to do this, then they are partners with Putin in the crimes against Ukrainians. They are partners. You cannot be in the middle here. You either are condemning the crimes or you are supporting the crimes. You can't have a middle position saying, oh, I don't want to take sides. No, it doesn't work like this. In a genocide, in war crimes, you decide, you support or you're opposed. And you're absolutely right that they don't want to deal with this question. It's too, it would destroy too many of their mythologies and stereotypes. And they just simply psychologically are unable to deal with this, but they have to deal with it. And especially in a post-Putin environment, and not just the Ukrainian war, the crimes of Stalinism, the cult of the Great Patriotic War and the cult of Stalin has meant that they have denied the crimes committed by this monster Stalin, who was the equal of Hitler, not only against Lithuanians or Latvians, Estonians, and Ukrainians and Belarusians, but against Russians also. Absolutely. I mean, Stalin murdered Russians. I mean, Timothy Snyder joked that Stalin killed more communists than Hitler. So, I mean, they're like living in this unreal world, which has been created for them by Putin in the last 2 decades. And everybody else has moved on. They've joined European Union, NATO, they've Europeanized, decommunized. Russia has stagnated under Putin. And that's why I think I stick to the point that Belarusians have greater chance of breaking through than Russians. Russians have a much more difficult.
Well, they consider themselves a gravitational, point that somebody has to gravitate towards them. They don't consider themselves a smaller body, that is, right. Kind of that needs to be gravitating towards some other values. They do believe that their values are some kind.
They believe, you're right. Yeah. Eurasianists believe that they are superior to Western culture, or what they call transatlantic culture. But this is just a Russian inferiority complex which has existed for hundreds of years. In reality, they're not superior at all. If you look at all of the statistics, divorce, alcoholism, death rates, abortions, Russia is higher than any country in the West. The average age of Russian men, what they live to, is the same level as Bangladesh, 58. So how are you superior? Tell me how your civilization is superior. You're not. This is a complete mythology. And I think what will have a major impact, and what is having an impact now, is how the war in Ukraine has showed that they are a Potemkin great power. This so-called second biggest or second most powerful army in the world is pretty useless, to be
Well,
quite honest.
this myth is gone already.
It's gone. Yes, it's gone. And I mean, they believe this crap because they even brought parade uniforms to Kiev, thinking they were going to do within 3 days a parade on the Khreshchatyk, the central street of Kiev. Those parades are now
240 days later, they're asking for weapons, from Iran because they don't have their own. So it's a very sarcastic story.
So I think the mythology of Russia as a great power is now in decline, and that's why it's already losing its influence. It's lost Central Asia. I mean, if your listeners just listen to the speech by the Tajik president a week ago, and my God, I mean, this is a small country. He would never talk like that to Putin if he felt Putin or Russia was strong. He basically told Russia, you need to respect us. So Central Asia is gone. The South Caucasus is gone except for Armenia. And the western part of the former Soviet Union, just Lukashenko is remaining. So I think Russians are going to have a rude awakening about the reality of the world once they are defeated in Ukraine.
Okay, so for the last kind of bit, I want to ask you. There are questions from different sources that came, from our viewers and supporters, and one is actually has repeated a few times, and it might be a bit offensive, but I anyway have to ask it because some people are questioning why it took Ukraine so long to adjust the course. And we already talked about Belarus, that their course is absolutely towards backwards and towards Kremlin and stuff like that. But they still have a chance. Russia, we just had a big bit of understanding why they are like they are. But if we're talking about Ukraine, the last revolution basically which broke through the ice was 2014. So it's still 14 years of not even 40, the 24 years of struggle of picking sides. What were the issues in Ukraine that it took so long? Because Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, or even Poland, which is a bit different story, but still they kind of knew from straight the beginning that their goal is to join the EU, their goal is to join NATO. Why the Ukrainian situation is a bit different?
Well, I would disagree to say that this is a long period of time. If you are I'm not a historian, but if you were a historian, they would say this is a very short period of time. It took the Irish to become a mature nation state as part of the European Union and to be free of British influence took them 100 years. And I have just been on holiday in Ireland. I just was at a conference and toured Ireland. And so I'm very pro-Irish. And it's taken them decades. These kinds of decolonization efforts take a long time. They don't just take a short period of time.
But you agree that there is to those who compare, let's say, the Baltic states, Poland and Ukraine, they see a bit of a difference in the attitude.
The difference is also that the West looked upon the Baltic states differently to how it looked upon Ukraine. The West had a guilty complex about the Baltic states because of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and the Baltic states were going to be invited to join the West as quickly as the West wanted it to. Ukraine first applied to join, first talked about joining the EU in 1999. It first talked about joining NATO in 2002. The West is not interested in allowing Ukraine to join. That was how it was already very different to the Baltic states and to Poland. Ukraine wanted to join. Ukraine leaders, President Kuchma, talked about joining EU and NATO back then. The EU always saw Ukraine as kind of a bit like Turkey, on the edge of Europe, not quite European, we don't know, too closely tied to Russia, so we can't invite them in. So Ukraine always had that problem. It was a kind of a kind of an Eastern European Turkey, shall we say.
What about the
Um,
size? Maybe the size also kind of a bit
yes,
scared,
yes,
you
of
know,
course,
the European
of
Union,
course,
because
of course, the size was maybe a factor, in that the amount of money you would need to modernize Ukraine. Yes, but I mean, there were large countries that joined the EU, like Spain as well, in after Franco. On NATO has basically, I think, been lying to Ukraine for a long period of time, because Ukraine first applied to join NATO in 2002, a year after 9/11, and the terrorist attack. And NATO has been kind of, pretending to say, yeah, you will join eventually. And they said this in 2008. NATO summit said, yeah, Ukraine, Georgia will, you'll be members one day. But, there was never any attempt to bring Ukraine into NATO. And you compare this to Finland and Sweden, as soon as they said we want to join, NATO said, no problem, tomorrow or today. So Ukraine has wanted to join these structures. It hasn't been invited in. On the question of inside the country, you've had a process of decolonization, I would call it. That's the best way to call it. In 1991, the USSR disintegrated peacefully. That was good, but it's also bad for national identity. Ironically, throughout history, countries' national identities develop quicker when there's a war, when there's conflict. I mean, that is just the way history has happened. The American identity was created by 1776, for example. Irish identity was created by the uprising in 1916. Ukraine identity is being created in 2014 and 2022. Not all of Ukraine identity, but Ukraine identity in Eastern Ukraine. Because what happened in Ukraine was that, and all of these countries, is that it's a fight for the borders, fight for your sovereignty, where are going to be the borders. And Stalin, he developed, he resolved the border problems between Lithuanian Poland and Ukrainian Poland in the 1940s. And so the Western Ukrainian border, which was always in conflict with Poland, ended. That conflict ended in 1947. There was the last kind of battles. So now we have the battle and conflict over Eastern Ukraine, over where the border should be in Eastern Ukraine. So in effect, this war, which is happening with Russia, is the war that should have happened in 1991 but did not, because Yeltsin, Gorbachev was weak. Yeltsin was always drunk in 1991, and Putin is very different to them. Putin has never come to terms with the collapse of the Soviet Union. He still thinks it was a crime, and he's continuously against it. So we have a war in Eastern Ukraine, which is developing faster, this Ukrainian identity in Eastern Ukraine. So we can thank Putin for actually nation building of Eastern Ukraine, because what we have today is opinion polls show that East Ukrainians are no longer different at all to West Ukrainians. There's no difference at all. You have the same high support for NATO membership in East Ukraine as you do in West Ukraine.
Well, at this point, I want to say that, like, recently we had one very influential voice speaking loudly on Twitter about all sorts of nonsense related to Ukraine. I'm talking obviously about Elon Musk and his all sorts of tweets that were published, and he was like saying in one of them that obviously not everyone voted for the pro-Russian party. Who voted for pro-Russian party wanted to join Russia, but it would be inaccurate to say that none did. And then there is an influencer who puts a map of 1991 when there was Ukrainian independence vote, and we see that Donbass, the Luhansk and Donetsk, it's 90 and 83% who voted, for independent Ukraine. What do you think our, American friends especially from the Republicans, what is their goal here, motive of, these voices that, this terrifying like narrative that is being spread, not even, of course, Republicans are there from the, let's say, Tulsi Gabbard, who just recently left the Democratic Party. She's saying that, let's not be stupid. The world is gonna end if we are not gonna stop this war and stuff like that. It's, of course, very ridiculous when you look from, Eastern or Central Europe perspective, because, but probably on the other side of the Atlantic, they have some motives. Could you explain what is happening here, like in your opinion, and maybe give some advice to the fellow Anglo-Saxons?
I advised on Twitter to Elon Musk to continue to be a good businessman and to stay out of politics and international relations, because you understand business, but you don't understand politics, international relations. It's not unusual for people with lots of money to think of themselves as experts on everything. So I mean, hello.
Yeah, yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. So I don't think it's unusual for these like big oligarchs and big businessmen to be so arrogant. I think it's quite typical that they are so arrogant that they think they can have an opinion about everything, in very complicated issues. So, I just ignored what he said, because it's happened before with people like that who think that they understand all these complicated questions. It's also, we live in an era of 24-hour TV, social media, and everybody's an expert on international politics. You read New York Times every day and you're somehow an expert. So I think that's just, unfortunately, the kind of era we are living in. As for Republicans, I don't think it's so much pro-Russianism. It's more the problem that some Republicans have said, look, we might not be able to give as much support to Ukraine as before because of the cost of living crisis. I mean, there is a cost of living crisis in the West with inflation, high energy prices, and such like. So I think that is more the issue. I don't think I've seen opinions of Western countries in their support for Ukraine. There is still high support amongst Republican voters and Democratic voters to support Ukraine. In fact, there are only 3 countries in Europe where there's low support, and those 3 countries are Hungary, Italy, and Greece. So
what about Serbia? Probably also low support.
No, not as much. No, it's I mean, I think those are the 3 countries they found. Hungary, because of course Orban. Greece traditionally is pro-Russian, and maybe because of Turkey's support for Ukraine, maybe. Italy, I don't understand, and it's embarrassing because my mother's Italian. But I think it's just because Italy is such a corrupt and disorganized country. But ironically, the new very right-wing, extreme right-wing leader of Italy, she's anti-Russian, anti-Putin.
Yeah, so she after the election, she kind of after Zelensky kind of congratulated her. She said that we are with Ukraine and we will support. So
yes. So what this shows is that the far right, or populist nationalists, shall we say, are not one group. Some are pro-Russian, some are not pro-Russian, and we see this with Poland, of course. There are no pro-Russian groups in Poland. I mean, if they exist, they're in the margin. They're completely marginal. The Polish government is completely pro-Ukrainian and anti-Putin. So it's a mixed picture. I mean, to me, Hungary is a complete tragedy, because it's like, we talk about zombification of Russians by Russian TV, but what about Hungarians? Have Hungarians completely forgotten about 1956? I mean,
That's a good question.
It's difficult to understand why are they so screwed up about this question. It's like, you know, Poland also lost territory after World War II, but accepted it and kind of moved on. And Hungary still seems to be crying about what happened in 100 years ago when it lost its empire. It's very bizarre, what's going on there. So I think on the whole, you know, I think Ukraine will continue to get support. But of course, support from the West means Ukraine has to continue to show it's being successful. And that's why these offensives, like in Kharkiv and Kherson, if Ukraine shows success on the battlefield, that will lead to continuing support from the West. The one thing I would just be maybe finishing critical about is why has it taken 8 months for the West to begin, for NATO to begin sending air defense systems to Ukraine? Why has it taken 8 months? Zelensky has been asking for air defenses for 8 months. And only now, because of Iranian attacks, because of these attacks, NATO and Western countries are sending air defense. I don't understand this, because the more Russia destroys in Ukraine, the more there will be need to pay for rebuilding Ukraine. So it's in the Western interest to this. So, I mean, hopefully those air defenses systems will come to Ukraine soon in the next few weeks.
Okay, Tara. So as usual, it was a pleasure to hear your thoughts, because it's always good to have someone who has both, I mean, academical background of the topic, and you know, you are, as you said, half Ukrainian yourself, so it's really close, you know, the topic close to you in all the aspects. So it was a pleasure. Hopefully not the last time. And thanks everyone for you know, subscribing and watching, and don't forget us on all the platforms, and talk to you in the next Let's Talk Europe episode.